The rain came down in sheets, turning the path from his cottage to the barn into a ribbon of black sludge. Kael pulled the collar of his oilskin cloak tighter, the wet wind biting at his ears. It was a miserable night, the kind that seeped into the bones and promised a long, cold winter. He had finished with the goats, their familiar, musty scent a small comfort in the vast, roaring dark. All that was left was to check the latch on the old barn door, the one that always rattled loose in a gale. His life had shrunk to the size of this small patch of land, bordered by the dark spine of the blackwood on one side and the unforgiving crags of the broken tusks on the other. It was a life measured in seasons, in the mending of fences and the turning of soil. It was quiet. It was empty. He had made his peace with that, or so he told himself in the long hours between dusk and dawn. The silence in his cottage was a presence, a heavy blanket woven from memory and resignation. He reached the barn, the wood groaning under the assault of the wind. As his hand closed over the cold iron of the latch, a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods caught his eye. Not the sway of a branch. It was something else. He froze, his heart giving a solid, painful thump against his ribs. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. Years of solitude had sharpened his senses to the subtle rhythms of his domain. This was wrong. He squinted, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead. 3 figures stumbled out from the trees, silhouettes against the churning gray sky. They were massive, far too large to be human. Orcs. His hand tightened on the latch until his knuckles were white. The stories from the nearest village, a half-day's walk away, were things of grim fantasy. Raids, stolen livestock, brutal violence. He had lived on this fringe for a decade and never seen one this close. 2 of them were supporting the third, a colossal figure that sagged between them like a felled oak. Even from this distance, he could see the exhaustion in their movements, the desperate, lurching gait of creatures at the end of their strength. They were not raiding. They were fleeing. As if to confirm it, a constellation of faint, bobbing lights appeared deep within the woods behind them. Torches. They were being hunted. They saw him then. All 3 stopped, their heads snapping up. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the drumming of the rain and the howl of the wind. He was one man. They were 3 orcs. His mind screamed at him to run, to bolt the door of his cottage and pray they passed him by. It was the sensible thing to do, the sane thing. But he didn't move. He saw the way the central figure's head lolled, the way the other 2 strained under the weight. He saw not monsters, but desperation. It was a look he recognized. He had seen it in the mirror years ago, in the reflection of a man holding a wife burning with fever, helpless as the life drained out of her. Against every instinct for self-preservation that had kept him alive this long, he gave a short, sharp nod. He unlatched the barn door and swung it open, the dark, hay-scented interior yawning behind him. An invitation. Then he stepped back, leaving the choice to them, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the wall of his chest. He had just invited the storm inside. They approached with a caution that bordered on menace. The 2 smaller orcs, though smaller was a relative term, as they still towered over him, flanked the wounded one, their eyes scanning the farmstead, missing nothing. They moved with a predatory grace that their exhaustion couldn't entirely mask. They were all female, he realized as they drew closer. Their features were broad, tusked, and brutally angular, but undeniably feminine. Their armor was a mix of iron plate and cured leather, scarred and dented from hard use. The one in the middle was the leader. It was obvious in the way the others deferred to her, the way their bodies curved protectively around her even as she leaned on them for support. A deep, ragged gash ran down her left side, soaking the leather of her tunic in a glistening, dark crimson. Her breathing was a harsh, wet rasp. They stopped a few feet from him, the rain running in rivulets from their dark green skin. One of the guards, her face a mask of grim suspicion, pointed a scarred finger at the barn. "No," the leader rasped. Her voice was like stones grinding together, low and full of pain. Kael met her gaze. Her eyes were the color of burnt gold, fierce and intelligent even through the haze of agony. They held no plea, only a defiant challenge. "The house," she said, each word an effort. "By the fire. Tonight." It was not a request. It was a demand, born of a desperate need not to be cornered, not to be treated like an animal in a stall. It was also a test. Kael thought of his small, warm cottage, his home, the last sanctuary of his quiet life. He thought of the empty chair by the hearth, the cold bed in the other room. He looked at the bleeding orc, at the unwavering loyalty in the eyes of her companions, and at the distant, menacing lights of their pursuers. "All right," he said, his own voice sounding thin in the gale. He turned and walked toward the cottage, not looking back to see if they followed. The back of his neck prickled. Every step was an act of faith, or perhaps monumental foolishness. He heard their heavy, squelching footsteps behind him. The storm was no longer just outside. It had followed him home. He pushed open the door to his cottage and stepped into the familiar warmth. The single room was small, dominated by a stone hearth where embers still glowed. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A narrow bed was pushed against the far wall, and shelves holding dried herbs, clay pots, and a few worn books lined the other. It smelled of wood smoke, bread, and loneliness. The 3 orcs filled the space, their sheer size making the room shrink. They brought the scent of wet pine, cold mud, and blood with them. The 2 guards, their names he would later learn were Urza and Shagrol, lowered their leader onto one of the chairs by the fire. She slumped into it, her head falling back, a low groan escaping her clenched jaw. The firelight flickered across her face, illuminating the harsh lines of pain and the proud set of her jaw. Kael moved with the deliberate, unhurried motions of a man long accustomed to his own company. He added logs to the fire, coaxing the embers back to a proper blaze. He did not look at them, focusing on the task, giving them a moment to breathe. He could feel their eyes on him, sharp and analytical. "What is the price?" The leader's voice cut through the crackle of the flames. He turned. She was watching him, her hand resting near the hilt of a wicked-looking short sword still belted at her waist. "Price for what?" he asked. "This. Sanctuary." Kael looked from her to the 2 guards standing like stone sentinels by the door. He thought about the smoldering ruin his life could become by morning. He thought about lying, about demanding some trinket or promise. But the words that came out were the simple truth. You were hurt. You were being hunted. The barn was cold. A flicker of something, surprise, disbelief, crossed her face before it was shuttered again. Men do not offer kindness without a price. "Snorts, lady, if I had tricks, I wouldn't live like this," he thought. He just shrugged. "I'm not other man." He gestured to the gash in her side. "That needs cleaning. It will fester." The guard named Urza stepped forward, a low growl rumbling in her chest. "We will tend to it." "With what?" Kael asked, his tone flat. "Mud and rainwater? I have boiled water, clean cloth, and a needle." The leader, Graka, held up a hand, silencing her guard. She studied Kael for a long, tense moment, her golden eyes seeming to peer right through his skin, weighing his soul. The pain was clearly getting worse. A sheen of sweat coated her brow despite the fire's warmth. "Go ahead," she finally whispered, the words barely audible. It was a surrender, a colossal risk. He knew it. She knew it. The air in the room was tight enough to snap. He gave a curt nod and moved to the shelves. He gathered what he needed. A pot for water, his sharpest skinning knife held in the fire until the tip glowed red, a leather-mending needle, and strips of clean linen he kept for his own injuries. The 2 guards watched his every move as he worked. He cut away the stiff, blood-soaked leather of her tunic, exposing the wound. It was deep, a vicious slice that had carved through skin and muscle. It was ugly, but looked clean, made by a sharp blade. He worked methodically, first cleaning the edges with hot water and a cloth. The orc leader, he didn't even know her name, didn't flinch, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the arms of the chair. Her breathing hitched with each touch. "This will hurt," he said, holding up the needle and a thread of gut. Her lips peeled back from her tusks in something that was not a smile. "It already hurts." He began to stitch the wound closed. His hands were calloused and clumsy, more used to the handle of a hammer than a needle, but his work was practical. He made strong, tight stitches, pulling the edges of the wound together as if he were mending a torn grain sack. It was a brutal, intimate act. He was so close he could feel the heat coming off her body, smell the iron tang of her blood. Beneath the pain and the alien toughness of her skin, he felt a tremor of vulnerability. She was just a body, trying to hold itself together. When he was done, he tied off the last stitch and covered his handiwork with a pad of clean linen. He stood up, his back aching. The entire time, she had not made a sound beyond the harsh control of her breathing. He moved back to the hearth and ladled some thin vegetable broth from the pot that was always simmering there into 3 wooden bowls. He set them on the table, along with half a loaf of dark bread. "Eat," he said. "You'll need the strength." He then took a spare blanket, walked to the far side of the hearth, and settled himself onto the floor with his back against the stone, pulling the blanket over his shoulders. He was giving them the room, the fire, the bed. He was giving them everything. The 2 guards looked at each other, then at their leader. She was watching him, her expression unreadable in the flickering light. After a moment, Urza moved to the table and picked up a bowl, sniffing it suspiciously before handing it to her chief. Shagrol took the other. They ate quickly, ravenously, like wolves. The wounded leader ate more slowly, her eyes never leaving him. When she finished, she spoke again, her voice a little stronger now. "You give us your bed. You need it more," he said, not opening his eyes. "I can sleep here." "Why?" That one word hung in the air. It was the real question, the one that mattered more than any talk of price. Kael thought for a moment, the warmth of the fire a comfort against the cold stone. Because no one should have to die in the rain if there's a roof nearby. He said it's simply a fact. He was thinking of Alara, of the cold that had taken her, of the helplessness. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. The truth of it settled into the silence of the room. He heard a soft grunt, a sound of acknowledgement. Then the scrape of the chair as one of the guards helped her lead her to her feet and guided her to the narrow bed. He heard the rustle of straw as she lay down, the soft murmur of the Orcish tongue. He did not understand the words, but the tone was one of care and concern. He stayed on the floor, listening to the sounds of the fire and the breathing of the 3 strange, dangerous women who had taken over his home. His quiet world had been shattered. He did not know if he would live to see the morning. But as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, he felt not fear, but a strange, hollow sort of peace. For the first time in years, the silence in his cottage was gone. Kael awoke to the smell of wood smoke and the rhythmic thump, thwack of an axe splitting wood. For a confused moment, he thought he had overslept, that he was late for his morning chores. He sat up, his back stiff from the floor, the rough wool blanket pooling around his waist. The fire had been built up, a healthy blaze roaring in the hearth. The cottage was warm. He looked towards the bed. It was empty, the blankets neatly folded. Of the 3 orcs, only the leader was present. She sat in the chair he had pulled for her wounded side wrapped in his linen, her posture stiff and regal despite the circumstances. She was sharpening her short sword with a whetstone from her own pack, the scrape of stone on steel a methodical, unnerving sound. She glanced at him, her golden eyes holding a neutral, watchful expression, and then returned to her work. The sound of the axe came again from outside. Kael got to his feet and peered through the single, grimy window. In the gray light of dawn, he saw the orc named Urza. She was at his woodpile, wielding his felling axe with an efficiency that was both terrifying and impressive. She was not just chopping wood. She was processing it, splitting logs with single, powerful blows and stacking the pieces in a neat, orderly pile. The other guard, Shagrol, was circling the cottage, testing the shutters, examining the door, her movements a clear patrol. They were not waiting for him to serve them. They were contributing, securing the perimeter, earning their keep in the only way they knew how. It was a statement, a nonverbal response to his actions the night before. We are not beggars. We are not helpless. He turned back to the leader. Your friends are busy, he said. We do not take without giving, she replied, not looking up from her blade. Her name, he had learned from the other's speech, was Graka. Reasonable. He busied himself with his own morning routine. He added water to the porridge pot, stirred in a handful of oats, and set it near the fire to cook. The domesticity of the act felt strange, observed as he was by a tusked warrior chief. He felt a need to appear useful, to show that he, too, had a purpose in this space. He took a broken leather strap from one of his goat's harnesses and began to mend it, his awl and sinew thread moving in familiar patterns. They worked in silence for a time, a strange tableau of domestic industry. The farmer and the war chief, each tending to their tools, the only sounds the scrape of her whetstone and the soft pop and hiss of the fire. The tension of the previous night had not vanished, but it had changed, settling from a sharp, imminent threat into a low, humming uncertainty. Urza came in, her face beaded with sweat, and dropped a final armload of firewood into the box by the hearth. It was more than he would have chopped in 2 days. She grunted a report to Graka in their guttural language, then took up a position by the door again, her arms crossed over her broad chest. Kael served the porridge, plain and unsweetened, into the same 3 bowls from the night before, and one for himself. They ate in silence, the orcs with a focused intensity, Kael with a deliberate slowness. He was acutely aware of every sound, every movement. He had shared his table with strangers before, passing traders or lost travelers. But this was different. This felt significant, as if he were sitting down with forces of nature. After the meal, Graka tested her side, wincing as she stood. The wound was holding, but she was still weak. She watched him for a moment, then gave a curt nod towards a dented piece of shoulder armor lying on the floor. A section of overlapping plates had been partially crushed, the leather straps torn. "Can you mend iron?" she asked. "Some," he said. "I have a small forge. For tools. Plowshares. Look at it." He picked up the pauldron. The metal was thick, crudely hammered, but effective. The damage was significant. A heavy blow from a mace or hammer, most likely. It had saved her shoulder from being shattered. He ran his thumb over the warped steel. He could heat it, hammer it back into a semblance of its former shape. The straps he could replace easily. "I can fix it," he said. She just nodded, as if she had expected the answer. The day passed in a haze of quiet work. He spent the morning in his forge, a small, soot-stained shed attached to the barn. The heat and the rhythmic clang of the hammer were a comfort, a return to the familiar. He lost himself in the work, in the feel of the metal yielding under his blows, the hiss of the quench, the smell of hot iron and coal smoke. He was a farmer, but his grandfather had been a blacksmith, and the knowledge was in his hands, in his blood. He worked carefully, not just repairing the damage, but tried to improve the piece, smoothing a rough edge here, strengthening a rivet there. It was his way of speaking, of continuing the strange, silent conversation they had started. When he returned to the cottage in the late afternoon, the pauldron restored, the orcs had been busy as well. Shagroll had repaired the loose shutter on the window and reinforced the bar on the door with a piece of scavenged iron. Urza had cleaned his hunting snares and oiled the leather. Graka sat by the fire, her leg propped up, methodically weaving a new strap for a bracer from strips of spare leather. They had integrated themselves into the rhythm of his life, their grim, martial skills turned to the maintenance of his small, peaceful homestead. He placed the repaired armor on the floor beside her chair without a word. She stopped her work and picked it up, her large, calloused fingers tracing the lines of the hammered steel. She examined his work from every angle, her expression unreadable. She tested the new leather straps, pulling on them with her full, considerable strength. They held. Finally, she looked up at him. For the first time, her golden eyes held something other than suspicion or pain. It was a flicker of respect, the grudging acknowledgement of a fellow craftsman. "Is good work," she said. "It will hold," he replied. That night, the tension had eased another notch. They shared another simple meal. He found himself less aware of their alienness and more aware of their exhaustion. The lines of strain were etched deeply around their eyes. They were still being hunted, This small pocket of peace was a temporary reprieve, a stolen moment. He fell asleep in his chair by the fire earlier than usual, the warmth of the forge still deep in his bones. The day's labor had been honest and hard, and it pulled him down into a heavy, dreamless slumber. He woke hours later, a shiver running through him. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and a chill had crept into the cottage. He was about to get up and add another log when he felt a weight settle over his shoulders. A heavy fur cloak, thick and smelling faintly of orc, leather, and the cold mountain air, was draped around him. He opened his eyes. Graka stood before him, a looming shadow in the dim light of the dying fire. She had pulled the cloak from her own shoulders to cover him. It was an act of profound, startling reciprocity. He had given her his bed, his medicine, his skill. She was giving him her warmth. He looked up at her, and their eyes met in the near darkness. The proud, guarded warrior was gone for a moment, replaced by someone more complex, someone who understood the currency of quiet kindness. There was no threat in her posture, only a silent acknowledgement of the debt between them. He simply nodded his thanks, too sleep-fogged to find words. She held his gaze for a second longer, then turned and retreated to the bed, her movements stiff from her wound. Kael pulled the heavy cloak tighter around himself. It was warmer than his own blanket. He settled back into his chair, the strange, foreign scent of it a bizarre comfort. He was a simple farmer. His world was supposed to be soil and livestock and the ghosts of his past. Now it was full of warrior women and unspoken obligations. He closed his eyes, not knowing what the next day would bring, but certain that something had irrevocably changed. The bridge between their two worlds, once impossibly vast, was now being built, one quiet gesture at a time. The fragile peace of the next few days settled into a routine. It was a strange, shared solitude. Kael would rise, find the fire already tended to and firewood stacked. He would make porridge, and they would eat together in the growing light. Then they would all turn to their work. He would see to his goats and chickens, mend his tools, or work the small patch of winter vegetables he kept near the cottage. The orcs would maintain their gear, patrol the perimeter of his land, or reinforce the small cottage in subtle ways, turning it from a home into a defensible position. They rarely spoke. Words seemed clumsy, inadequate. Their communication happened in deeds. He found a freshly butchered rabbit on his doorstep one morning, cleaned and ready for the pot, a gift from Urza Snares. He, in turn, spent an afternoon grinding down the edge of Shagrol's axe, giving it a keenness it had lacked. It was a barter of skill and effort, an economy of mutual respect. One evening, as a cold wind rattled the newly reinforced shutters, he sat by the fire, carving a small wooden bird for no reason other than to keep his hands busy. It was something he used to do for his daughter. The thought came unbidden, a familiar ache in his chest. Graka sat across from him, her leg propped on a stool, her wound slowly healing. She was watching his hands, her gaze distant. "You had a family," she stated. It was not a question. Kael's hand stilled. He looked down at the half-finished bird in his lap. "I did. What happened?" Her voice was low, stripped of its usual harshness. He didn't want to answer. The story was a stone he carried in his gut, heavy and cold. But in the quiet of the room, with the wind howling outside like a hungry wolf, the silence felt heavier. "The winter sickness, 5 years ago," he said, his voice flat. "My wife, Alara, and our daughter, Maya. There was no healer close enough. I did what I could. It wasn't enough." He didn't say more. He didn't describe the fever, the helplessness, the silence that followed. He just offered her the hard, unadorned facts. Graka was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled, spitting embers onto the hearthstones. "Loss is a cold bedfellow," she said finally, her gaze fixed on the flames. "I had a brother, not by blood, but by oath. Gorbash. We were raised in the same creche, fought in the same shield wall. I trusted him with my life." She paused, her hand unconsciously drifting to her wounded side. "He valued my command more than my trust. He paid others to open a space in my guard during a skirmish on the border. The blade that cut me was meant to kill me." She spoke of it with a chilling matter-of-factness, the betrayal a settled thing, a part of her history now. She did not name herself as a leader of great import, did not speak of clans or armies. She framed it as a personal betrayal, a story of a broken oath, mirroring his own story of personal loss. It was a cautious offering, a piece of her history laid bare in exchange for his. "So you ran," he said. "We fought," she corrected him, a spark of the warrior returning to her voice. "We broke their line and ran. To live, to fight another day." He looked at her, at this powerful creature brought low by treachery, hiding in a human farmer's hovel. He looked at the half-carved bird in his hands, a relic of a life that was gone forever. They were from different worlds, a farmer and a warrior, a human and an orc. But in that moment, by the fire, they were just two people defined by what they had lost. The bridge between them strengthened. The next morning, the bridge was tested. Kael was returning from the goat pen when he saw it. A symbol, carved crudely into the top rail of his fence. A tusk split down the middle. It hadn't been there yesterday. His blood ran cold. It was a marker, a sign for a hunting party. He didn't run to the cottage. He walked, his movements deliberate, his face a stony mask. He pushed open the door. The three orcs looked up from their tasks. He didn't need to say a word. They saw it in his eyes. "They found us," he said. Instantly, the quiet domesticity of the past few days evaporated. The air crackled with a lethal energy. Urza and Shagrel were on their feet, grabbing their weapons. Graka pushed herself out of her chair, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword. The warrior chief was back, her eyes hard and sharp as flint. "How many?" she demanded. "I don't know. I only saw the sign." "Scouts," she grunted. "They will be cautious. They don't know what they will find." She looked around the small cottage, her gaze assessing its pathetic defenses. Then she looked at him. "You should leave. Take your animals and go into the woods. This is not your fight." It was an order, an offer of release. He could take it. He could abandon his home, his land, and run. It was the smart thing to do. His farm was just wood and stone and dirt. It could be rebuilt. His life could not. He looked at the hearth where they had shared their stories. He looked at the bed where she had slept. He looked at the heavy fur cloak still draped over the back of his chair. This was more than just his home now. It was a sanctuary he had offered, a promise he had made, unspoken. "No," he said. Graka's eyes narrowed. "This is suicide for you. You are a farmer." "It's my land," he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. "They're not welcome here." He picked up the heavy iron poker from the hearth. It was not a sword, but it had weight. It was something, and it is my fight. You're a guest in my house. A strange light entered Graka's eyes. It was not pity. It was not gratitude. It was a raw, fierce respect. She gave him a sharp, dangerous smile that showed both of her tusks. "Then stand," she said. The scouts came at midday. 3 of them, large, brutal-looking males clad in piecemeal iron and mangy fur. They strode into his yard as if they owned it, their arrogance a palpable force. One of them, clearly the leader, had a jagged scar across his face that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. Kael stood in the doorway of his cottage, the iron poker held loosely in his hand. He was terrified. His heart was a frantic bird beating against his ribs. But he stood. "Human," the scarred orc barked, spitting on the ground. "We know you have the fugitives, the female traitors. Give them to us, and we will let you live in your hovel." "This is my property," Kael said, his voice steadier than he felt. "There's no one here you want. You should leave." The orc laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. A farmer with a fire poker. "Are you going to threaten us with your goats next?" His companions chuckled. He took a step forward, his hand going to the crude axe at his belt. "Last chance, human," he said. A low voice growled from behind Kael. "You are not welcome here." Graka stepped out of the shadows of the cottage, flanked by Urza and Shagrel. They moved with a fluid, deadly purpose. Graka was not fully healed. She still moved stiffly, but the sight of her, sword in hand, was enough to make the scouts recoil a step. Her presence was immense, an aura of command and violence that the farmer lacked. The scarred orc's eyes widened, then narrowed in hatred. "Graka, Gorbash will be pleased. He wants your head himself." He could try to take it, Graka snarled. The fight was over almost before it began. Kael had told them about the patch of ground near the barn where a broken drain pipe always created a deep, muddy sump after a rain. As the lead orc charged, Kael shouted, "Now!" Urza, positioned perfectly, slammed the butt of her spear into a precariously balanced stack of firewood, sending it cascading into the path of one of the other orcs. It was all the distraction they needed. The leader's charge faltered as he tried to avoid the rolling logs, his foot sinking deep into the mud Kael had pointed out. In that moment of imbalance, Shagroll was on him, her movements a blur of brutal efficiency. Kael, acting on pure adrenaline, swung the heavy poker at the third orc, who was momentarily tangled in the falling wood. The blow was clumsy, but the iron was solid. It struck the orc's shoulder with a sickening crunch of bone. The orc roared in pain and fury, turning on him. Kael stumbled back, his life flashing before his eyes. But before the orc could bring his own weapon to bear, Graka was there. Her short sword moved in a swift, vicious arc that ended the threat permanently. It was a slaughter. 2 of the scouts lay dead in the mud of his farmyard. The third, the one with the broken shoulder, was disarmed and held down by Urza's spear point at his throat. He looked at Graka with terrified eyes. Graka limped over to him, her face a cold mask of fury. She looked down at the trembling survivor. "Go back to Gorbash," she said, her voice like ice. "Tell him the farmer Blackwood sends his regards. Tell him to come himself, if he wants my head. And tell him to bring more than 3 pups next time." Urza pulled back her spear. The scout scrambled to his feet, clutching his ruined shoulder, and fled into the woods without a backward glance. Silence descended on the farmyard, broken only by the cawing of crows and Kael's own ragged breathing. He looked at the 2 bodies lying in the mud, at the dark blood seeping into his land. He looked at his hands, still gripping the iron poker. He had not killed anyone, but he had fought. He had stood his ground. Graka turned to him. The fire of battle was still in her eyes. She looked at him, then at the poker in his hand, and then back to his face. She saw his fear, his shock, but she also saw that he was still standing. "You did not run," she said, a note of wonder in her voice. "I told you," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It's my home." The small victory felt hollow. They had sent a message, but they had also confirmed their location. The hornet's nest had been kicked. The main swarm would be coming. Kael knew it. Graka knew it. His quiet life was not just shattered. It was over. What came next would be a battle for survival. The hours that followed the skirmish were heavy with anticipation. They dragged the bodies of the dead scouts into the woods, a grim task that left the smell of blood lingering in the air. Kael's hands shook as he washed them in the water barrel, the familiar act feeling alien. He had seen death before, but it had been the quiet, passive death of sickness. This was different. This was violent and sudden, a brutal intrusion into the natural order of his world. Clear's throat. They prepared for the inevitable. There was no more pretense of simple farm life. Under Graka's direction, the cottage was transformed into a miniature fortress. They barred the window, not just with a shutter, but with the heavy table propped against it. They stacked firewood and sacks of grain against the weaker walls. Kael brought every sharp or heavy tool he owned in from the barn, pitchforks, scythes, hammers, and laid them out like a desperate armory. His small world, once a place of peace and solitude, was now a trap waiting to be sprung. He felt a profound sense of loss, watching the transformation. This was no longer the home he had shared with Alara, the place where he had raised his daughter. It was a battleground. Just as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting long, bloody shadows across the land, a new figure appeared at the edge of the woods. This one was alone, and moved not with the arrogance of the scouts, but with a weary urgency. It was another female orc, older, her face a roadmap of scars, her armor bearing the same clan markings as Graka's. She carried a tattered banner on a short spear. Urza and Shagroll immediately raised their weapons, moving to intercept her, but Graka called out a sharp command in their tongue. The old orc approached, and upon seeing Graka, dropped to one knee, bowing her head. "War chief," she rasped, her voice thick with exhaustion and grief. "I saw the scout. I knew you were alive. War chief." The title landed on Kael like a physical blow. He stared at Graka, seeing her in a completely new light. Not just a betrayed warrior, not just a leader of a small, loyal band. A war chief, a commander of armies, a figure of immense power and status within her culture. Royalty of a grim, martial sort. The old warrior, whose name was Karga, delivered her report. Gorbash had seized control of the clan's main fortress. He had declared Graka a traitor and a coward, claiming she had fled the border skirmish. He was consolidating his power, hunting down anyone still loyal to her. But his hold was not absolute. Many of the older warriors and clan elders were suspicious. Karga had escaped with a handful of others and had been searching for Graka ever since. And Gorbash was coming. The scout had returned, and Gorbash, enraged by the defiance and the mention of a human farmer, was leading a war band of at least 20 himself. He wanted to make an example of her, to crush her and her last remaining followers publicly. Kael listened to the exchange, understanding only bits and pieces of the Orcish language, but grasping the full, terrifying picture from Karga's tone and Graka's grim expression. He felt a chasm open up beneath him. All their interactions, the shared meals, the quiet moments by the fire, the exchange of histories, it all felt like a lie. He had seen her as an equal, a fellow survivor. But she was a queen, and he was just a pawn in her game, a convenient hiding place. The sense of betrayal was sharp and bitter, more painful than any physical wound. He felt small, insignificant, used. He had risked everything for her, stood his ground for her, not for a fellow fugitive, but for a hidden monarch. The intimacy he had imagined between them was just his own foolish projection. Graka must have sensed his withdrawal. After dismissing Karga to get food and rest, she turned to him. The confidence she had worn during the skirmish was gone, replaced by a troubled uncertainty. "Kael," she began. "War chief," he said, the title tasting like ash in his mouth. "You should have told me. Would you have helped a war chief of the orcs?" She countered, her voice low. "Or would you have barred your door, as any sane man would? I helped a woman who was bleeding in the rain." He shot back, his quiet anger surprising them both. "I didn't ask for a title. I asked for nothing. But you let me believe we were the same. Two people with nothing. But you have a clan, a command, a war. I have this." He gestured around the barricaded cottage, at the ruins of his peaceful life. "This little patch of dirt, and it's about to be soaked in blood because of a fight that was never mine." The hurt was plain on his face, raw and undisguised. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, regret, perhaps. She took a step toward him. "What we shared, the fire, the stories. That was not a lie," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "I did not show you the war chief, because you did not look at me and see one. You saw someone in need. You saw me. No one has looked at me like that in a very long time." Before he could answer, a horn blast, deep and guttural, echoed from the woods. It was answered by another from the other side of the farm. They were surrounded. Torches bloomed in the twilight, a ring of fire closing in on his land. Gorbash had arrived. The siege began with a volley of arrows that thudded into the walls of the cottage like angry fists. Kael and the four orc women were plunged into a desperate fight for survival. The small cottage, which had seemed so sturdy, now felt like a tinderbox. Gorbash's voice bellowed from the darkness. "Graka, come out and face your judgment. Your human pet has lived long enough. He talks too much," Urza growled, peering through a crack in the wall. The battle was a blur of chaos and terror. They tried to set the roof on fire with flaming arrows. Kael and Shagrol scrambled to beat out the flames with wet sacks, the smoke filling the small space, making their eyes water and their lungs burn. Orcs charged the door, the heavy wood groaning under the impact of their axes and hammers. Kael fought not like a warrior, but like a cornered animal. He used his knowledge of his home as a weapon. When an orc finally splintered a panel of the door, Kael was there to thrust a sharpened pitchfork through the opening. He didn't wait to see the result, just pulled it back and stabbed again. He passed weapons to the orc women, pointed out a weak floorboard near the hearth, overturned the pot of boiling water when they finally breached the window. He was a part of their shield wall, his practical knowledge as vital as their martial skill. The barn caught fire first, the dry hay and old wood going up with a roar. The light of the blaze illuminated the yard, turning the battle into a hellish scene of dancing shadows and glinting steel. Kael's heart broke as he saw the flames engulf the structure he had built with his own hands. His world was literally burning down around him. Finally, the front door splintered and broke, and the enemy was inside. The fight devolved into a desperate, close-quarters melee. The cottage was too small for such a battle, a chaotic whirlwind of blades and bodies. Shagroll went down, a grievous wound in her leg. Karga, the old warrior, fought like a demon, taking 2 of Gorbash's warriors with her before she was overwhelmed. It was just him, Graka, and Urza left against a dozen or more. They were going to die here. Then, Gorbash himself stepped through the ruined doorway. He was massive, even for an orc, clad in black iron armor and carrying a huge, 2-handed axe. His eyes, full of triumphant malice, fixed on Graka. "Sister," he sneered, "your reign is over." He and Graka met in the center of the room, their blades clashing with a sound like thunder. The other orcs fell back, forming a circle to watch the duel that would decide everything. As they fought, a lone orc, seeing an opportunity, charged at the wounded Urza from her blind side. Kael saw it happen. Without thinking, he threw himself in the way, tackling the charging orc around the legs. The move was clumsy, born of desperation, but it worked. The orc crashed to the floor, his charge diverted. Kael scrambled away, just as the orc's axe swung wildly, missing his head by inches. Graka saw it all. Even in the midst of her life-or-death struggle with Gorbash, she saw his selfless, suicidal act to save her last loyal guard. Her duel with Gorbash had been a deadlock, a brutal exchange of blows. But now, something in her shifted, a new fire lit in her eyes. She broke away from Gorbash with a powerful shove and raised her voice in a bellow that cut through the roar of the fire and the clang of steel. It was a formal, ritualistic cry that made every orc in the room freeze. "Kael, of the Blackwood," she roared, her voice echoing with the power of her station. Everyone, including Gorbash and Kael himself, stared at her. "You sheltered my blood when I was hunted. You tended my wounds when I was broken. You stood your ground when I was besieged. You have defended my honor with your life. I, Graka, war chief of the Stone Tusk clan, see you." She pointed her sword at him, the tip glinting in the firelight. "I claim you," she shouted for all to hear. "Stand with me. Stand with my clan. Your hearth is my hearth. Your life is my life. I claim you." The declaration hung in the stunned silence. It was not just a thank you. It was a formal, binding offer. An adoption, a political alliance, a marriage proposal, in a brutal calculus of her people. It was an act of public defiance, elevating a simple human farmer to a status unheard of, tying his fate to hers in front of her greatest enemy. Gorbash stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. "You would shame our bloodline with this soft-skinned runt. He has more honor in his farmer's hands than you have in your entire body," Gorbash, Graka snarled. To her warriors, the few that were left, and to those of Gorbash's who were now looking at Kael with a new, confused respect, she had just declared him worthy. She had just declared him Orkin. The moment of stunned silence was broken. Urza, energized by her chief's declaration, let out a war cry and surged to her feet, ignoring her wound. The few remaining loyalists fought with renewed ferocity. Kael, still on the floor, looked at Graka. The war chief. She was offering him a future, a place, protection. She was offering him a life beyond the ashes of his farm. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing a fallen hand axe. Gorbash, seeing his authority challenged and the tide of the battle turning, roared in fury and charged at Graka again. But Kael was moving too. He got her side, his small, human frame next her towering one. He looked at her, the woman he had nursed, the chief who had claimed him. The firelight danced in her golden eyes. "I will not stand behind you," he said, his voice raw and hoarse from the smoke, "but clear in the din, or under your protection." She looked at him, her expression questioning, even as she parried a blow from Gorbash. "I will stand beside you," he finished. It was not the acceptance of a subject. It was the pledge of an equal, a partner. He was not asking for a place in her world. He was defining his own. A fierce, bloody smile split Graka's face. In that moment, she saw him. Not a weak human, not a useful tool, not a subject to be protected. She saw Kael, a man with a quiet strength, as unyielding as mountain stone. "Beside me," she agreed, and together they turned to face their enemy. The fight was no longer a duel. It was 2 against 1. Kael was no match for Gorbash in strength or skill, but he didn't need to be. He became a distraction, a persistent threat at the edge of Gorbash's vision. He harried him, forcing him to divide his attention, creating openings that Graka exploited with brutal precision. His clumsy attacks with the hand axe were easily parried, but they forced Gorbash to turn, to adjust, to lose his rhythm. It was this partnership, this unexpected synergy between the massive, powerful war chief and the small, tenacious farmer, that sealed Gorbash's fate. While Gorbash was occupied, turning to swat Kael away like a bothersome fly, Graka drove her short sword deep into a gap in his armor at the hip. Gorbash roared in pain and fury, staggering back. The duel was over. He was wounded, his authority shattered by Graka's public declaration and his inability to dispatch a simple farmer. He looked at Kael with pure hatred, then at Graka with a dawning fear. His remaining warriors, seeing their leader falter and witnessing the power of Graka's claim, hesitated. Their loyalty was broken. Sensing his defeat, Gorbash spat a curse and, using the last of his strength, smashed a support beam with his axe. "If I cannot have this clan, no one will," he bellowed as the burning roof began to groan and sag. It was a final, spiteful act. He turned and fled into the night, his loyalists scattering behind him. The roof. Urza yelled. The fire-weakened structure was coming down. Kael grabbed the arm of the injured shagroll, heaving her up, while Graka did the same for the few other wounded loyalists. They stumbled out of the collapsing cottage just as the main beam gave way, sending the entire roof crashing down in a shower of sparks and flame. They stood in the yard, breathing heavily, silhouetted against the inferno that had been his home. His cottage, his barn, his fences, everything was gone. A pyre for his old life. He looked at the smoking ruins, the place where he had known love and loss, and, for the last few days, a strange and dangerous kind of hope. He felt a deep, profound pang of sorrow for the ghosts that were now lost to the flames. But beneath the sorrow, there was no despair, only a strange emptiness, a blank slate. Graka came to stand beside him, her shoulder almost brushing his. She was bleeding from a dozen minor cuts, covered in soot, but she stood tall, the undisputed war chief once more. Her followers, a battered handful, were gathering around her, their gazes a mixture of awe and respect. "He will not get far," she said, her eyes on the dark woods where Gorbash had fled. "His power is broken. The clan will rally to me now." Kael said nothing, just watched the flames consume the last of his past. "We leave at dawn," she said after a moment. It was a statement of fact. There was nothing left for them here. Nothing left for him here. "We ride for the Stone Tusk Fortress. My home." He finally turned to look at her. "I have never ridden a horse," he said, a statement of such simple, absurd truth that it hung strangely in the epic devastation around them. Graka looked at him, at his soot-stained face and the determined set of his jaw. A slow smile touched her lips, a genuine one this time, without the edge of battle. "Then you will learn." The journey to the Stone Tusk Mountains was an ordeal. Kael, true to his word, was a terrible rider. He spent the first few days clinging grimly to the back of a shaggy mountain pony, his body aching with a misery that almost made him miss fighting for his life. The handful of orc survivors treated him with a reserved, confused curiosity. He was the Kael kin, the human farmer their war chief had claimed. They didn't know what to make of him. He was an outsider in every sense of the word. He was small, soft-skinned, and utterly ignorant of their customs. In the evenings, around their campfires, he was an island of silence in a sea of guttural Orcish speech. They offered him the choicest cuts of roasted meat, a sign of respect for his new status, but the gesture felt awkward, forced. He found his place not through words or attempts to fit in, but through work. When a strap on Urza's saddle broke, he repaired it with a skill that made her grunt in appreciation. When their supply of arrowheads ran low, he found a rocky outcrop with iron-rich and explained to Graka how, with a proper forge, he could smelt it. He was a maker, a craftsman. In a culture that valued strength and martial prowess above all else, his quiet, practical skills were a strange and foreign currency. Graka saw this. She did not try to turn him into a warrior. She seemed to understand that his strength lay elsewhere. She would watch him as he worked, a thoughtful expression on her face. Their relationship had changed again. In the ashes of his farm, they were partners. Here, on the road to her world, she was the war chief, and he was something else. Her consort, her strange human prize. The power imbalance was immense, and it chafed at him. When they finally arrived at the mountain fortress of the Stone Tusk clan, it was a sight that stole his breath. Carved into the very face of a mountain, it was a city of gray stone, soaring towers and smoke-belching chimneys, connected by rope bridges that swayed over dizzying drops. It was a place of brutalist grandeur, as grim and unyielding as the orcs themselves. His arrival caused a sensation. The clan turned out to see the return of their victorious war chief, their cheers echoing off the stone walls. And they turned out to stare at the small, strange human at her side. He heard the whispers, the snorts of derision. Manling soft-skinned pet, the prejudice was a thick, suffocating blanket. Graka ignored it. She walked through the crowds with her head held high, Kael deliberately at her side, not a step behind. It was a clear, silent declaration to her entire clan. He is with me. He is one of us. The days that followed were a struggle. He was given chambers adjoining Graka's, rooms of cold stone and heavy furs that felt more like a cage than a home. Orcs challenged him, not openly, for he was the chief's chosen, but in subtle ways. They would shoulder past him in the corridors, sneer at his lack of tusks, or hold fighting contests in the main hall, their eyes daring him to join. He ignored them. He did not try to fight their way. He found his own way. He claimed a disused smithy high up in the fortress, a soot-blackened cavern reeking of old fires. It took him a week to clean it out, to repair the broken bellows and crumbling chimney. The orcs watched him, mystified by his tireless, mundane labor. Then he began to work. He built a proper forge, better than the one he'd lost. He began to process he had found. He made nails. He made hinges. He shod their war beasts with shoes that didn't crack. He took their crude, heavy blades, and, using the techniques his grandfather had taught him, he retempered them, making them stronger, more flexible, able to hold a sharper edge for longer. Word of the forge husband, as they began to call him, spread through the fortress. Warriors would bring him their favored weapons, not with sneers, but with a grudging respect. He would take the blade, feel its balance, and set to work, the clang of his hammer echoing through the high halls. He wasn't one of them. He would never be. But he was useful. His worth was undeniable, written in fire and steel. Months passed. The snows came, blanketing the mountains in white. The fortress became a self-contained world. Kael found a rhythm. His forge was his domain, a place of warmth and purpose. His relationship with Graka settled into a quiet pattern. She was busy, consumed with the politics of her clan, rebuilding what Gorbash had broken. But she would come to his forge at the end of the long days, bringing him food, or simply to watch him work in the glow of the fire. In these moments, she was not the war chief. She was just Graka, They would talk not of war or politics, but of the quality of the coal or the way a blade curved. They found their common language again, the language of makers, of those who shaped the world with their hands. One evening, she came to the forge holding a piece of her own armor. It was the clasp on her breastplate, a complex piece of interlocking metal that had been damaged in a training exercise. "Can you mend it?" she asked. The question was a callback to that first day in his cottage, but the tone was entirely different. There was no test in it, only trust. "Of course," he said. She began to unbuckle the heavy breastplate. He moved to help her, his hands sure and familiar with the straps and buckles of her armor. Their hands brushed. The touch was not accidental or hesitant. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the bond between them. He took the damaged clasp and set it on his anvil. As he worked the hot metal, heating it, shaping it, strengthening it, she did not retreat to a stool. She stood beside the anvil, watching his hands, the focused intensity in his eyes. She was not a chief observing a subject. She was a wife watching her husband. When the repair was done, stronger and more elegant than before, he turned to her. The breastplate lay on a nearby bench. He picked it up. It was heavy, a solid wall of steel designed to turn aside blades and arrows. He held it up for her. She stood before him, and he settled the armor over her shoulders. The weight of it was immense. He reached around her to fasten the straps, his arms encircling her. For a moment, they were locked in an embrace of leather and steel. He could feel the warmth of her body through her tunic, the steady beat of her heart. He fastened the newly repaired clasp at her throat. His fingers, calloused from the hammer, were gentle against her skin. Their eyes met. The forge was filled with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron, but in her golden eyes he saw the warmth of his lost hearth, the memory of a shared fire, and the promise of a future. His world of earth and wood and quiet ghosts had been burned away. In its place, he had found a new world of stone and steel and a fierce, living partnership. He had been a man defined by what he had lost. Now, standing in the heart of a mountain, armoring the formidable woman who had claimed him, he knew he was a man defined by what he had chosen. And what he had chosen was to stand beside her. Always.